All right, today we're going to dive into one of history's biggest what-ifs. I'm talking about the League of Nations. You know, it was this incredibly ambitious, maybe even a little tragic experiment in world peace. I mean, this was a radical idea, born right out of the rubble of World War I. The whole point was to completely change how countries dealt with each other, to make sure that the so-called war to end all wars was actually, well, the last one.
So just think about this for a second. What if the entire world could actually unite to stop wars before they even got started? I mean, really imagine it. A world where if one country attacks another, it's considered an attack on everybody. That's the huge game-changing idea that was right at the core of the League of Nations. It was a bold attempt to just rip up the old rulebook on how wars happen.
Okay, so to really get the League, you've got to put yourself back in time. We're talking 1919. The whole planet was just staggering, reeling from the absolute devastation of the First World War. I mean, the scale of it was something nobody had ever seen. So there was this desperate, worldwide feeling, this hunger for a new way, anyway, to make sure a disaster like that could never, ever happen again.
And the League of Nations? Well, that was supposed to be the answer. It was a complete 180 from the old way of doing things, All those secret deals, those backroom alliances, that whole game of power politics. Instead, the League put forward this vision of a future built on something totally different, talking things out in the open, countries actually working together, and this one big idea that was supposed to change everything. They called it collective security.
So that all sounds great, right? But what was the actual plan? I mean, how is this thing supposed to work in the real world? Let's get into the nitty-gritty and break down the security blueprint they came up with.
Okay, so the absolute core of this whole thing was a principle called collective security. And honestly, the easiest way to think about it is like a giant global neighborhood watch, right? If one country, the bully on the block, starts picking on another, the idea was that every other country in the neighborhood would step in together to shut it down. That was the dream anyway.
And they had a clear process for how this would work, kind of like a ladder of escalation. Step 1, a country attacks another. The League points the finger and says, "You're the aggressor." Step 2, a massive wave of global condemnation. Everybody shames the aggressor. Step 3, if that doesn't work, bam, crippling economic sanctions. Cut off their money, cut off their trade, and then, only as the absolute last resort, Step 4, joint military action. The whole point was to make a country think twice, or 3 or 4 times, before even thinking about starting something.
So to make all this happen, the League had a structure. There was an assembly, where every member country had a seat. Then you had the Council, which was kind of like the big deal committee for handling major crises. And finally, a permanent court of international justice to sort out legal squabbles. On paper, it really looked like a working world government.
But, and this is a huge but, there was a massive flaw baked right into its DNA. That super important council, the one that was supposed to deal with the biggest threats, well, to do anything, they often needed a unanimous vote. Unanimous. Can you imagine trying to get a room full of countries, all with their own agendas, to agree on literally everything? Yeah, that was going to be a serious problem.
Now look, it's really easy to just write off the League as a total failure, but that's not the whole picture. Seriously. In its early days, especially during the 1920s, the blueprint actually seemed to be working. They had some real wins. I mean, they did some genuinely good stuff. They stepped in and sorted out smaller border fights that could have blown up. They provided a ton of humanitarian aid to refugees who were left homeless by the war. They even helped coordinate the global fight against diseases like typhus, and they were a big voice pushing for better, safer working conditions around the world. These weren't just small things. These were real achievements that made a difference. But, and here's that but again, there was a big catch. All these successes, they pretty much only happened when the big players, we're talking Britain, France, were already on the same page. The second a problem popped up that actually threatened one of their core interests or asked them to make a real sacrifice, well, suddenly all that spirit of cooperation just seemed to evaporate.
And that right there, that brings us to the real heart of the problem. Why? Why, with all these noble ideas and even some early wins, couldn't the League stop the slide into another world war? What went so wrong?
Well, it turns out that beautiful, simple theory of a global neighborhood watch, it ran smack into a brick wall. And that brick wall was the messy, complicated, and, let's be honest, often selfish reality of how nations actually behave. You see, the gap between the idea and the reality was just huge. The theory said, we'll all act together for world peace. But the reality was, yeah, but what's in it for my country?
National self-interest almost always won. The theory said the world will stop bullies. The reality? Most nations weren't about to risk their own soldiers' lives or wreck their economies for a fight happening halfway across the world.
When you get right down to it, the League's fatal flaws were there from the start. Flaw number 1, it had no army. Zero. It was like a cop with no badge and no gun, completely relying on other countries to do the enforcing. Flaw number 2, the United States, the biggest new power on the world stage, never even joined. Can you imagine? That was a massive blow to its authority right out of the gate. And flaw number 3, as we talked about, that crazy unanimity rule. It just created constant political paralysis.
So where does that leave us? What's the big takeaway here? I think the League of Nations is this perfect example of a paradox. You have this incredibly powerful, beautiful idea that just couldn't survive in the real world of power politics.
And that really sums up the tragedy of it all, doesn't it? The League was the shining beacon of hope. It was a symbol that maybe, just maybe, humanity could figure out a better way. But when it really came down to it, when it had to face down aggressive, militaristic countries in the 1930s, all those weaknesses we talked about meant it was basically powerless.
And so it all boils down to this one question. A question that's just as real today as it was 100 years ago. This is the lesson that the United Nations was built on, the ghosts of the League of Nations hanging over it. And the question is this: can you actually keep the peace with just good intentions and ideals? Or do you always need the power, the credible threat of force to make it stick?